And here we go. I think we are live. Yes, we are live now. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Kyle Dalton, the Membership and Development Coordinator for the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. It's been a while since I've done one of these live streams, and some of you who've been with the channel for a while may recognize me from a year ago. Glad to be back and glad to have a first-time guest with us. Joining us today is Hugh Goffinet. Thanks for joining us, Hugh.
I'm so happy to be here. Thanks so much, Kyle, for having me.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about Howard Medical School and the Civil War. Hugh's going to be really driving the bus on this. He knows a lot more than I do on this topic. Before we get into it, though, I did want to give a couple of quick plugs here. First of all, thank you for those of you who are already in the chat, introducing yourselves from Orlando, Florida, and as far away as Venezuela. Thanks for joining us today. I wanted to also let you know that we are a private nonprofit. We rely on money from supporters like you. If you're not a member, consider becoming a member. It's the best way to support us. And right now we have a really exciting appeal. We have a reproduction ambulance wagon, a Rucker model ambulance wagon that we're trying to get repaired. Many of you have already given generously, and thank you all so much for those who've already done that. Jan, I see you in the comments there. You've been kind enough to give twice to this appeal. Thank you so much for doing that. So if you haven't done so, please consider doing it. It is our most popular hands-on exhibit for the museum. We'll put a link in the comments here in just a bit if you would like to give. But I think that's enough of me going on. If you've got any questions during the stream, feel free to drop them in the chat. I'll be able to see them. Hugh will not, unfortunately. That's just the way the stream works. I will read them to him, and we'll try to get to all your questions as we go. So feel free to drop them in at any time. Having said that, Hugh, thank you again for joining us.
Oh, literally my pleasure. Thank you again. I really appreciate, giving this platform to talk about something that's very near and dear to my heart.
Could you tell us a little bit about yourself? I of course, have met you years ago, but I'm sure our audience would like to know more.
Sure, I'd love to. My name is Hugh Goffinet. I am a student at the one and only Howard University in beautiful Washington, D.C., where I study both history and African-American studies. This, topic of, Howard University, med school, and the Civil War is something that's very near and dear to my heart. Well, even though I have absolutely no ties to med school, talking about the history of my university and just the incredible impact that it has really had on the United States, whether it be the Civil War, Reconstruction, the years that followed, even today. I'm just proud to be able to tell just an ounce of my university story and hopefully, influence others to begin to take a deeper dive into the incredible story of HBCUs in the United States of America. So that's sort of about me, it's sort of about the program, but yeah.
Great. And we've got people coming in from all over the country. Barbara coming to us from Central Iowa, Vanessa coming from Columbus, Mississippi, and McKenna coming from Utah. Thank you all for joining us today. Now, Hugh, you mentioned the term HBCU. For any of our audience that might be unfamiliar with that, what does that mean?
Sure, of course. HBCU stands for Historically Black Colleges and Universities. Howard University is one of the more famous of them. Of course, you have Morehouse in Atlanta, you have Spelman in Atlanta, Hampton University. These are all universities coming out of the periods, before and immediately after the American Civil War as a means for creating opportunities for higher access to education for African Americans. Because of course, with segregation, Black people were not granted access to the Harvards or the, Ohio State universities of the world at that time. Just because there was no access to education, outside of, the public schools that are being created in the aftermath of the Civil War in the Deep South. A lot of these universities like Howard, Fisk, et cetera, are coming out of the Deep South as a means of providing education for newly freed African Americans, but also further education opportunities for those who've already had that educational background, which is where stories like the Howard Med School, kind of come into the fold. But short and sweet, HBCU stands for Historically Black Colleges and Universities.
Great. And actually, we have a follow-up question in the comments here from
Okay.
Jan. She wants to know when Howard University was founded.
Sure. Howard University was founded in 1867 in Washington, D.C. by the famous Union military general, who you all may recognize from battles like Gettysburg and Chancellorsville, named Oliver O. Howard. He was the 11th Corps, commander during the fighting at Gettysburg and also Chancellorsville, where unfortunately his command did not perform very well. So he has a very, very, mixed reputation during the American Civil War. But after the war, Oliver O. Howard becomes the head of the Freedmen's Bureau, the agency that was in charge of, the transition of formerly enslaved African Americans into this life of freedom that, for again 4 million people, they had never ever had the experience of. So they're setting up, banks. They're creating avenues for workers who have had problems with their employers to kind of negotiate deals and work out disagreements. And then most importantly, they've provided access to education. Howard University is one of those places. And as a result of Oliver O. Howard's incredible work in founding Howard University, the university now takes his name. It's an incredible story. I could talk about it for hours. It starts out almost as like a Black West Point, where the first students at Howard University are required to wear uniforms and do military drills and salute their professors, and to, the incredible story that it now carries on today with the current Vice President of the United States and other great figures and leaders like Chadwick Boseman, all being alumni of this university. But that's the short and sweet on the founding of Howard, and I guess a little bit about its relevance today.
So it sounds like an institution that was steeped in the Civil War. Even though it was founded after the war, it is a direct consequence of it, named for a general of the new freed community. Was the medical school sort of the same story? Was that also born out of the Civil War?
So it definitely was. I will say that the medical school's ties to the Civil War are less blatant as, say, the founding of Howard University, but it's still definitely there. Kyle, are you able to bring up that slide deck? Because that's actually a perfect segue into the meat of this conversation.
Sure thing.
Perfect.
Just a moment.
Sure.
Being a little uncooperative.
Oh, no worries. So as Kyle is bringing this up, I'll go ahead and get started into the meat of my topic, which again is about Howard University's medical school and the American Civil War. So if you go on to the next slide for me.
Hey.
So really the conversation about Howard University's med school, Howard Hospital, the whole tie to the American Civil War begins with the concept of contrabands, which some of you may be aware of, some of you may not be. So I'm going to give a very brief description of who contrabands were, what the experience was like, and why they're relevant to the conversation of Howard Medical School and the Civil War. The US military recognized that the way to defeat the Confederacy was by depriving them of their access to labor in the South. And of course, one of the many ways. And of course, for the Confederacy, that labor primarily rested in the hands of enslaved African Americans. So as the US military marches down south, or any African Americans who are enslaved in Confederate states are able to, seek refuge within Union military lines, they are being accepted as contraband of war or confiscated property, because the federal military realized that they couldn't really do much unless legally they recognized that these people were the property of other human beings. And therefore, because these human beings who are owners of these so-called property and is using this so-called property to further the Confederate military's successes on the battlefields of the American South, that the US government, federal military, is able to confiscate this human property as a means of creating the supply shortage of labor in the American South. One of the key locations where a lot of these refugees, African American refugees called contraband, ended up settling upon leaving their places of forced servitude throughout the South was Washington, D.C., which, of course, after 1862, when D.C. ends slavery, this becomes one of the primary locations where African Americans come to seek refuge. The first in the Mississippi Valley, South Carolina, but DC was very much up there. One of these contraband camps was established in northern DC, kind of sort of near 7th Street, Florida Avenue, in that general location where Howard sits today, called Camp Barker. Camp Barker was founded in 1862 and had a hospital associated with it called Freedman's Hospital. Those of you who may be aware of the history of Howard University's hospital, that name may actually have some relevance. Will, I guess, start turning some gears in your head, because the original name for Howard University Hospital was Freedman's Hospital. Do you mind going to the next slide for me, Kyle? So Freedman's Hospital was really incredible because, one, it was established to treat newly freed African Americans. Of course, because these people had no, health care. This was 1862, 3, 4, 5, in the middle of the American Civil War. There were new methods created to allow African Americans access to healthcare, and Freedman's Hospital is very much the fruits of the federal military and the federal government's labors to provide equal access to education, as well as equal access to medical care for newly freed African Americans. The team here at Freedman's Hospital composed of about half a dozen Black physicians, two of which you see here. You have William Powell Jr., who was the son of a Black New England doctor and a Native American mother. So I think that's a really cool story there too. And he became an assistant surgeon during the American Civil War. He was actually contracted out by the United States Army, which made things a little bit more difficult for him, as far as his standing in the military and the post-war experience for him. And I want to ask Kyle if Kyle would be willing to talk a little bit more about the idea of assistant surgeons during the war, what the experience was like for them, why were they contracting out, surgeons instead of actually just using and enlisting them into the U.S. military? Because again, that's very essential to the experience of a lot of these Black doctors after the American Civil War.
Sure thing. There's a few different ranks for physicians in the Civil War through the medical department. The one that's most widely known is that of the regimental surgeon, sometimes just referred to as surgeon. They're a commissioned officer, they're higher ranking, they're often in charge of delicate surgeries, and at least later in the war for the United States, as well as the South, they are vetted. They have to prove their worth. At the beginning of the war, they don't really do that as much. Only federal regiments are required to vet their surgeons, subject them to a board of examination. The whole U.S. Navy does it, but for the Army, it's kind of hit or miss. And some sawbones get through, some quacks. And as the war progresses, they get better and better. There are also assistant surgeons. These are all usually also PhDs. They may be newly minted PhDs. They may just be not making the cut for that higher level. They're slightly more numerous than the regimental surgeons. And then there's acting assistant surgeons, referred to as contract surgeons. These surgeons do not receive a commission. Even so, they often wear uniform. They often go to the same places that everybody else is going, performing the same duties that everyone else does. They are private physicians. They are not required to wear a uniform. They're not subject to certain regulations within the medical department and the military, but they are subject to review. So they are still fundamentally doctors. They have PhDs. They know what they're doing. Being a contract surgeon is a strange sort of gray area. And sometimes it's used as an excuse to keep doctors out of the mainstream, out of the flow that might permit them to get to a higher rank. This is certainly the case for Dr. Mary Walker, a famous contract surgeon, feminist. There's a whole list of things to her name as a humanitarian. She is awarded the Medal of Honor, the first woman to receive the Medal of Honor, and it is revoked later in her life, well after the war, on the grounds of her being a contract surgeon. She refuses to give it back, is buried with it, and much later in the 20th century, that Medal of Honor is reinstated. But again, it goes to show that sometimes the contract surgeons exist for those communities that people are worried about advancing too far. And I'm sure that's the case for USCT surgeons, United States Colored Troop surgeons. But I'm sure you can say a little more about that as well. So that's just a brief rundown of those different ranks within there. The surgeon, the assistant surgeon, and the acting assistant surgeon or contract surgeon.
Yeah, I think that's an important distinction to make because you do see a mix of the regimental surgeons being at Freedman's Hospital, but the vast majority were these acting assistant surgeons. We'll make that distinction clear as
it's a mouthful.
So crucial. It is, it definitely is. Oof, by all means. William B. Powell, again, the two individuals that were on that slide deck, you have Anderson, Ruffin, Abbott, and then William B. Powell. William B. Powell actually, after the war, he attempted to receive a pension for his service with the United States military during the war. And because of his status as a contracted surgeon, he was unable to receive that pension for his service. The other person there, Anderson R. Abbott, was a Canadian who came to the United States for the purpose of, well, providing care for, soldiers and civilians in the United States during the American Civil War. And actually, he was present and attended to Abraham Lincoln in the aftermath of the assassination attempt on the president in April of 1865. His wife, Mary Lincoln, actually gave him a shawl that Abraham Lincoln wore during the inauguration in 1964 as a testament to the appreciation that the Lincoln family had for, Mr. Abbott's dedication and duty, and attention to Abraham Lincoln during his time of need. Can I get the next slide? Now, in addition to the William B. Powells, the Anderson Ruffin Abbotts, you actually have Alexander T. Augusta, who is the highest ranking African-American to serve in the American Civil War. He was a doctor, also from Canada, who came down to the United States to provide his services. He became the regimental surgeon for the 7th United States Colored Infantry Regiment, a Black unit raised out of Baltimore, Maryland for service in the Civil War, saw action in Florida, and then up in Virginia, chasing Robert E. Lee during the fighting around Petersburg and Richmond at the closing of the conflict. Alexander T. Augusta, Colonel Augusta, is very important because he was the head of Freedman's Hospital. He was the one who oversaw the William B. Powells, the Anderson Abbotts, and the next person we'll talk about, Charles Purvis, and had a really influential role in the development of that hospital. After creating Freedman's Hospital and taking leadership there, he's then transferred to Louverture Hospital in Virginia, but eventually comes back into DC proper to found Howard Medical School in 1868, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Can I get the next slide? Because the last person that I want to talk about and really profile of the half a dozen or so is Charles Purvis. Charles Purvis was a African-American physician who was also, he was not a contracted surgeon, just like, Alexander T. Augusta was not. He served in the American Civil War as one of the providers at Freedman's Hospital, and eventually, after the cessation of hostilities, not his commission, but his time in service ends, he returns back to Howard University, which at this time is well underway. It's about 2 years in, and joins the staff at Howard University's medical school in 1869. Charles Purvis is actually really unique because, similar to Anderson Abbott, he was there to care for President Grover Cleveland after the assassination on him in Washington, D.C., during his time as President of the United States of America. Can I get the next slide here? And this really brings us into the further conversation about the beginning of Howard Hospital, the beginning of the Howard Med School, and where the Civil War story of Camp Barker and Freedman's Hospital can really be tied into the greater story of Howard University's medical school. Because again, that connection isn't terribly obvious until you really start looking at those deeper layers. The facility at Camp Barker, the Contraband camp where Freedman's Hospital was originally located, was demolished in 1865 with the end of the American Civil War. It was moved a little closer to where Howard University sits now along Florida Avenue, where it ran in conjunction with the medical school, which opened in 1868. The medical school is really unique because while the founders of the medical school, just like the founders of the university, were all white, save for one person, who we'll get back to that in a second. They did a very good job about providing equal access to education, regardless of color lines. Many people, when they think of HBCUs, think of it as like the reverse racism idea, where it's a school that only serves Black people, where nobody else is allowed to receive an education there. And that was certainly not the case. I mean, the first students at Howard University in general were several white women who were the children of the university's founders. And that was certainly also very much the case with the medical school. The first class, 1868, had 7 African Americans and 1 white student. So again, I mean, the best of the best coming to Howard University, regardless of skin color, but however, catering to the needs of African Americans who really have no other alternatives to gaining access to this medical instruction in much of the United States of America, even after the end of the American Civil War. Now, I mentioned that, like the university, you have white folks taking the lead in founding the medical school, with the exception of one person. That one person is Alexander T. Augusta. He returns back to DC proper in 1868 and is among the, again, half a dozen or so founders of the medical school when it opens up in 1868. Charles Purvis, who I mentioned before, then returns back to Howard University, where he works at the hospital, which continued to retain the name Freedmen's Hospital until roughly like the end of the 20th century, the late 1900s. And he actually does like double time, both teaching the medical school and working in the hospital, similarly to what the current president of the university, Dr. Wayne Frederick, does today. He is a medical provider by trade, and in between his time, working as a president of the university, he continues to practice medicine at Howard University Hospital, as Freedmen's Hospital is now known as today. And this starts to bring us into the relevance, like the why does this matter, the so what of it? Because yeah, I could sit here and I could talk about Howard University because I care about it, but I'm talking about Howard University's medical school because it matters. I mean, some of the best and the brightest in the Black medical field either received their education here at Howard or taught here at Howard University. I'm going to give an example of one of each. The first is Roland Scott, who attended Howard University in the 30s, coming here for undergrad and then also for med school. He becomes a pediatric provider, working in the pediatric department of the hospital, eventually becoming the head of the pediatric department at Howard Hospital. But he is not known for being a pediatric surgeon, right? Roland Scott, for those that are aware of him, is known for creating a new understanding of sickle cell. He saw in Black children that sickle cell was something that was really sweeping through the African American community and wanted to really understand what it was, why it was affecting African Americans, and attempt to create a cure for sickle cell. Roland Scott was a product of Howard University's med school, returning back here to teach. But another is Charles Drew, who initially attended med school here, but of course offered his services to the med school and the hospital. Charles Drew now is actually known for creating new methods for preserving blood during the Second World War. This was incredibly useful because, of course, this now enables blood transfusions to happen as soldiers are losing large amounts of blood through combat injuries in the battlefields of Europe and in the Pacific and in Africa and wherever World War II is being fought, of course, being a global conflict. Charles Drew was there to create that new method for preserving blood that could then be used to replace the blood that these soldiers lost. Charles Drew was also really cool because as a Black man, he was really in tune to the bigotry within the War Department in response to this blood preservation and the blood transfusion process, because blood was segregated, just like people were segregated. White and Black blood was not to be mixed. Actually, Charles Drew raised quite a fuss, rightfully so, about this, and actually came to Howard to teach and offer his services to create the newest generations of Black doctors, physicians, nurses, etc. So Howard Medical School has an incredible history and continues to have an incredible legacy, even now, 150 55 odd years after its founding in 1868. Well, again, I'm not tied to universities, medical school. I'm still very much tied to the university as a whole. And I'm very, very proud of its ties to the American Civil War, its legacy, and its future as one of the predominant, educators of Black doctors in the United States of America, even to this day in 2021. So this concludes the meat of my presentation. Kyle, I don't know if you had any extra questions for me or if there were any questions in the chat, but I can go ahead and open it up from here.
I do want to acknowledge Jill Newmark in the comments. If I'm not mistaken, Jill, and feel free to correct me, I think you work at the National Library of Medicine, does a lot of writing on Black doctors in the Civil War. Thank you for joining us. She had a few things to add. One is that she says Abbott was not present at the deathbed of Lincoln. It was another white physician named Abbott. Abbott was there for treating him, though, when he was first brought over. So just to clarify that, he wasn't there when Lincoln died, but he was there for treatment. She also points out Augusta was born in Norfolk, Virginia. You mentioned him being Canadian. That is still true. He went up there in 1850. So he was a Canadian citizen by the time the Civil War started. It's not wrong to say he's Canadian, but we do want to add that nuance in. There were many Black Americans that made their way to Canada, especially in the pre-war years, after the Fugitive Slave Act, when even the northern states couldn't give them the security that they were hoping for. So thank you for bringing that in.
Thank you so much again, too, for adding that extra context. I appreciate it.
Yes, thank you, Jill, for joining us. Maggie joined us from Shiloh, Tennessee. Thank you for joining us. And Jan also says, you mentioned World War II. Did Howard graduated doctors participate in World War I?
So that is really outside of my area of expertise. There were Black doctors that served in the First World War. I would be very unsurprised to see Black doctors serving in World War I who are graduates of Howard Med School. You certainly were seeing this during World War II. Howard University's connection to World War II is something I'm much more savvy with, but I would be very unsurprised to see that being done in World War I. But I can't give you any actual examples of names of people who were Howard Med School grads who served in World War I, unfortunately.
Now, you also mentioned that you're not a part of the med school. What are you studying at Howard?
Sure. I'm studying history. That's my major, and I'm a minor in African American studies. I'm a current sophomore at the university. I would love to pursue a career in museums and focus on Black history, Black social history in particular. So Howard University's history department is very much focused on Black history. We don't have concentrations here because any student who comes to the history department receives a concentration in Black history. So I wanted to come to learn with the best and get the best education I possibly can in my particular academic niche. And that's what brought me here. And that's why I'm a history major at this wonderful university. So, a lot of what I'm talking about here is stuff that we learn about here at the university, that we talk about, because of course there is this, I guess you could say, like an esprit de corps that's built within the university students, whether it be because of the alumni who radically changed the world, or just the pride of being in a university that was created to provide education to African Americans when really nobody else would. So that's what I study. That's why I'm here. It's a great place to be, and I really couldn't see myself anywhere else.
And we got a question in the comments from McKenna, who's joining us from Utah, asking, do you have any museum experience? And I can at least preface this by saying that's how we met. At the last museum that I worked at, Hugh helped me organize this wonderful event, tearjerker of an event, exploring the weird space that enslaved people in Maryland fell into between the Emancipation Proclamation and the new Maryland State Constitution that ended slavery in late 1864. And that strange liminal space they were in, Hugh helped me to organize that. So I can say he's got at least some experience in museums. But would you like to talk a little more about your museum experience?
Sure. I definitely want to, give Jordan Bernardi his due credit for that one. That was, definitely his brainchild. I helped in limited capacity, but that incredible event, at Historical Land and Town Gardens was put on by Jordan Bernardi. I do have experience in other fields. I and other museums. I currently work as a contracted living historian, doing educational programming on African Americans in the Civil War for middle school and high schools across the country. That's for the National Medal of Honor Heritage Center in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I've done various internships with, the National Park Service, like a volunteer internship with the African American Civil War Museum, located like 2 blocks away from where I'm at here at Howard University. So I do have a good bit of experience with museums. There's always more to learn, so I'm very blessed that Kyle is willing to, serve as like a mentor and give me some guidance in this field, whether it be hands-on through helping with that event in London Town, or, getting to do stuff like this, like little educational programs for a wider audience on something that's, still new to me, but something that I'm very proud and excited about getting to share with you guys here today. So thanks, McKenna. It's good to see you in the chat. It's a good friend of mine.
We've got a few other questions in the comments. Before we jump back into those, I do want to once again remind you that we are a nonprofit. If you enjoy programs like this, if you enjoy conversations like this, consider supporting us. Visit that link in the chat there to help support our restoration of a reproduction ambulance wagon, our most popular hands-on item. I also want to quickly plug Hugh. He has a great Instagram account. That's actually how I reached out to him for this. Would you like to talk a little bit about your USC Trooper account?
I would love to. So my history Instagram is USC Trooper. It is, mainly focusing on the African American military experience in the United States, as well as the Black military experience abroad, mostly during the period of colonialism, imperialism in Africa and in the West Indies. I'm very, very fond of African American military history. I'm the child of 2 active duty service members, my mother and my father, who I love dearly, and they gave me this appreciation for military history. Which, as I got older, it became less of like this cowboys and Indian style appreciation, into more of like a nuanced appreciation of the social history behind African American contributions to the military. So my Instagram is mostly focused on how Black veterans have gone on to change the world for better, regardless of where they were born in the world. So that's the short and sweet on USC Trooper, which again, USC TROOPER, and you can find that on Instagram.
I'm going to actually jump ahead now that we're in this space where we're talking about both the past and present and how it's happening now. I'm going to jump ahead in some of these questions. There was one asked about what has life on Howard campus been like in the recent day-to-day?
That's a great question. Howard University, a lot of you guys may be aware of, recently underwent a little bit of turmoil, very warranted turmoil. For about a month, students overtook the Blackburn Student Center in a protest that very much harkens back to like the 1920s, the 60s, and the 80s, when Howard students, rose up against administration and fought to create a better academic learning space for all students. There were issues in the dorms with mold. There were mushrooms growing in some of the walls. There were issues with homeless students because Howard University had promised to give students housing, and then just for whatever reason, that housing was not provided. I myself, I was a recipient of the GI Bill thanks to my wonderful parents, and there's an issue that has thankfully now been rectified, where because of some paperwork not being, filed, that I, for a while, lost my ability to pay for school through the GI Bill. So as much as I love this university, and as incredible as it truly is, like most universities, there are some problems that exist. This isn't this isn't me trying to knock down where I go to school. Is I think me coming here and talking about the medical school, something I don't even attend or have an association with, and it's ties to the Civil War, and the way that I talk about Howard to speak about my appreciation for this university. But recently, as some of you guys may know, that there was the month-long takeover at Blackburn, which, if some of you guys are interested, you can find a lot of news articles at CNN, Washington Post, etc. Vice News did a really cool piece on them. So that's been very much in our midst recently. It was thankfully resolved about 2 or 3 days ago. An agreement was reached between the university's administration and the students. We're still in the aftermath of just the university's response to that. I personally was there at Blackburn, watching the horrific response of Howard University's, police and local police officers shoving students to the ground, pulling out batons, grabbing their service pistols in response to student protesters, right? So that's Howard University right now. But this is all done to ensure that the next generation of Bisons just don't have to experience what we had to experience here in the dorms. Because no one should really have to experience black mold being in their vents or on their walls or covering their clothing, while ultimately comes from the best and the brightest of the Black community in the future. I love my school. I'm proud of it. It's a great place to get education. I couldn't have chosen a better location, here in DC. But like most schools, there's some problems. But yeah, that's Howard in 2021.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how so many of the struggles you've mentioned, how this is almost a throwback, the way that these students are being handled, the way that these students are protesting, that it just seems to be kind of happening again. And as historians, as people that study this, we see why it's so important very directly to draw that line, that relevance from the past to the present. Along with that, it does mean that there are some challenges. And that brings me to this question by Jan about doing the actual research. How do you tease information about Black doctors, et cetera, out of public records when so little attention was paid to them in the late 18th and early 20th centuries?
So it's very difficult, right? I'm blessed that Howard University does a really good job about talking about them. Of course, this is very base level information that you could even get from a really simple Google search on each of these individuals. But Howard University, being a university that is so incredibly dedicated to just spreading knowledge and awareness about its incredible history, has done a really good job about promoting a lot of this knowledge. The Howard University Archives at the Moreland Springer Research Center has a ton of great research. National Archives has a ton of great research. Kyle was so great about giving me some good research and some good knowledge as I kind of pulled this together from different sources and talking to some different experts in the field. So it's not always easy. My main focus has been African-American combatants during the Civil War, which is another difficult topic to research because there's a few books out there currently, but it's never going to be the same amount of books that are out there about Gettysburg or Vicksburg or First Manassas, right? Or the amount of books that are out there on Abraham Lincoln. You will never have that breadth of not knowledge, but of information being put out about these topics in 2021. It's just not there yet. And part of that is because a lot of that information is difficult to access. So that's big picture, but I think it gives you a taste of the story of researching a lot of these Black positions during the American Civil War. Thankfully, there were very popular people, so there's a lot of information about there. Alexander T. Augusta was very well respected, whether it be his service during the war. There's numerous photos of him or his time at Howard University. Charles Purvis being very similar as well. But yeah, it's not always easy, but there's definitely ways to get that information. And I think being at Howard is one of those easy avenues that I've managed to find as far as getting an access to some of that news. It's a great question.
And this is an interesting question as well. You mentioned that military training and uniforms at the start of Howard were similar to those of West Point. Was this a decision to base operations off of West Point directly, or was it just a general influence?
So Oliver Howard was a West Point grad. He used his experience at West Point to create Howard University. The first class in 1868 was very much not that military experience, but when Howard comes here in the late 1860s, early 1870s, as the actual president of the university, he makes that change very quickly. Actually, it was a requirement to do ROTC and military style training through the Department of Military Science, which was here at Howard even before ROTC was founded during the aftermath of World War I. And in, I think, 1925, the first major student protest happened here because students were upset about the fact that it was a requirement to graduate to take military science, even if you wanted to become a doctor or even if you wanted to, become a teacher. It's something that had absolutely nothing to do with the military. You were still required to take classes here. You had to do your PE requirements, do military science. Actually, if you miss a certain number of PT days, you could be expelled from the university. So as we were talking about like the continuation of Howard University's resilience and struggles to create a better Howard, for future generations of Bisons, this can all be traced back to even, Oliver O. Howard and his decision to turn Howard University into a Black West Point, which thankfully didn't last very long. It was only a few years. The university had some financial struggles towards the end of like Reconstruction, and that plan went by the wayside because it was way too expensive. But it's still a big part of our history. And I mean, the fact that we still have an ROTC, both Air Force and Army, is very much a testament to our beginnings as a university that was a proud supporter of the military, founded by service members with connection to West Point, and continued to be developed and, I guess widely appreciated because of a lot of our Black military service members who have ties to the university even to this day.
Great. We do have a couple more questions. Unfortunately, we're not going to get to all of them. The clock's starting to run out here. So I'm going to jump back to one real quick. There seems to be a fascinating pattern of refugees traveling to Canada only to return to the war zone to assist. What are your thoughts on this pattern?
I think it's really interesting. A lot of the United States colored infantry regiments, colored cavalry, heavy artillery, whatever, these Black combat units in the Civil War had large numbers of Canadians, people who were born in Canada, descendants of formerly enslaved African Americans, descendants of Afro-Canadians. Of course, Black people have been in Canada for as long as Canada's been in existence for the most part, returning back to the US to fight in this war because of this feeling of contributing to the greater good. Like, how can I sit here and enjoy, this freedom, this access to education when 4 million of my brothers and sisters are held in chains, throughout the American South? They felt this duty, this calling to provide an access to freedom, for people of African ancestry, not even just here in the U.S., but across the globe, as we can see like these conversations happening between West Indian revolutionaries fighting against slavery in like the 1830s and the late 1700s in Haiti, Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, etc. Talking with African Americans in the U.S., coming to the U.S., people in Canada coming to the U.S., and these conversations throughout the Black diaspora of resistance, of rebellion, of fighting to create a better future, for all people of African ancestry. And so this dedication to what we would now, I think, consider to be like a Pan-African sentiment of, just we're all connected in this struggle, we're all brothers and sisters of the diaspora, the spreading of Africans throughout the globe as a result of the slave trade or the willful movement of Africans out of the continent. All this is very much connected in the conversation about Afro-Canadians coming back to the United States to serve in the Civil War as surgeons or as combat soldiers, or even, serving, in civilian entities, providing meaningful support for the combat operations of the U.S. military, during that conflict. So I think it's really cool because it's something that I can really appreciate, being someone who is Jamaican, who isn't descended from, people who've been, at least on the side of me that has African ancestry. I'm biracial. My father's white. His family's been here since the 1820s. My mom's side has been here since like the late 20th century. So I don't have that deep connection, but I can still relate to and appreciate the fact that this international dialogue of African descended people, coming to a point during the American Civil War as one of the more prominent countries in the so-called New World of the Americas, coming to blows with the institution of slavery, and people from Jamaica, from the West Indies, from Cuba, from Haiti, coming here to support the cause of freedom and liberty, just like Afro-Canadians did as well. So it's all connected, and it's something that it's very near and dear to my heart, at least. It's a great question, actually. Thank you for asking.
Thank you all for joining us. I'm afraid the clock has run out on us here. So once again, I'm going to plug our pluggables. The National Museum of Civil War Medicine is a nonprofit programs like this are made possible by viewers like you, by members like you. And I see some members in our comments who've been so generous lately. And I want to thank you all for joining us. If you want to become a member or if you want to support our current annual appeal, check out the link in the chat here. I'll also put it in the description of the video if you're joining us after this has premiered. Hugh, I'll pass it back to you to once again pitch your great Instagram page.
Sure. I want to say thank you so much to all the viewers coming here to watch, those sharing knowledge, asking questions, putting their 2 cents into this amazing conversation, because we're all here to learn together, right? We're all here to grow as peers. So I really appreciate you guys' communication throughout this program. I hope you're able to learn a little something. Hopefully it, maybe influence you to do a little more research into the story of HBCUs or, Black physicians and providers during the American Civil War era. You can find me at, again, USC Trooper, that's USC TROOPER on Instagram. And I'd be more than happy to talk to you guys, or you can feel free to just look through my posts and learn a thing or two about something hopefully you haven't heard about before. Because there's definitely some really unique stuff that I've uncovered and had the privilege of sharing on that page. Thanks again, Kyle, for having me. It's been a pleasure getting to work with you. Thank you.
Yeah, always good to talk to you. Always good to see you. Hopefully we do more like this in the future. So again, thank you, everybody. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Be sure to subscribe to our channel and check out some videos that we got coming up in the next few weeks. All right, we're good.
Cool.